Hello, Zero Hour. This is Mr. Mooney here with the first of two videos for our Unit 4 notes. So this section of the notes will cover the third of the three paradigms. So we've already looked at the consumerist and purity paradigms. So we'll cover the last, the Catholic paradigm. And we'll also cover selection from the papal document Humanae Vitae, which was written by Pope Paul VI shortly after the Second Vatican Council. The second video will have to do with theology of the body and carry through Ronald Rolheiser's spirituality of sexuality from the book, The Holy Longing. So just some background quickly. The first paradigm we covered was the consumerist paradigm, where we looked at the transactional nature of relationships that we tended to view as the quote-unquote secular view. We also looked at a response to that secular view, the purity paradigm, which was more of a puritanical, rule-based view of relationships. And as you might imagine, the Catholic paradigm falls somewhere in the middle. I think you'll find most things in life do find themselves somewhere in the middle. The real answer ends up in the middle somewhere. And so the Catholic paradigm attempts to be a unified worldview, right? We used the term last year, worldview, for stewardship and ownership. The Catholic paradigm attempts to be that by recognizing that the love that we have for one another, not just as people on this planet, but in particular as spouses, is a sacrificial love. It is a gift of self to one another. And so your life, your relationship moving forward, should you be called to the vocation of marriage, is a gift of yourself to your spouse. And should you not be called to the vocation of marriage, your life, your energy is a gift of self to the community. And so that's an important thing to pay attention to, because not everyone is going to be called to marriage, but that doesn't mean that just all of a sudden the energy that you have, the spiritual and the eros, right, to use terms from a previous chapter, just goes away. What we look at in the church has to do with a lifelong process of sanctification, to use the terminology from the first unit, to live a life as close to Christ-like as possible, as close to sainthood as possible. And so to just view the Catholic Church's teachings on spirituality and on sexuality as just about sex is very nearsighted, because we're called to continually display that love for God and neighbor, for God and spouse, all the time, everywhere. And we are the model. We are God's hands and feet on earth. Therefore, it can never be something that is so limited as to just be about one dimension. Ultimately, when we do talk about the physical side, and we do talk about, marriage in particular, we're talking about two main purposes of that gift, which is union with your spouse and procreation. And that procreation can take on a lot of different forms, as we'll see in the next slide here. The point is to have an act that is ordered toward the good of the other and not oneself, so that sort of removes the transactional nature of the consumerist paradigm. And to highlight the complementarity, the union and the perfect oneness of the man and the woman, which sort of negates the objectification of women, but found in both the purity and consumerist paradigms. And I really like this line from the film Rocky to deal with this complementarity. In the original Rocky and Adrian are ice skating. And Rocky makes a comment that his parents told him he wasn't born with much of a brain, so he'd better use his body to earn his keep. And Adrian laughs and says that's basically what her parents said, but it was the opposite. She wasn't born with much of a body, so she better use her brain. And in one of Rocky's more philosophical lines, he says that, well, that's okay, we just fill gaps. In other words, you have weaknesses and strengths, I have weaknesses and strengths. Alone, we must bear that burden, but together, we can make something greater. Together, we can be something unified and whole. And I think that line is surprisingly poignant coming from a film that many people wouldn't expect it. So this document I referenced, Humanae Vitae, is a document that if you were to Google and you were to look at the Wikipedia blurb, I was looking at it because I was trying to figure out how to pronounce it, if I'm being honest with you. Latin students probably could do a better job than me. And when I looked at the tagline for subject said that it was about contraceptives, which I thought was fascinating because you have this document that is dedicated to human vitality in life, right, as evidenced by the title. And it is boiled down to contraception by the Google algorithm or Wikipedia algorithm. And so ultimately what you have in this document is an upholding of marriage as a unifying creation, a manifestation of our image and likeness of God, right? Not as a physical image and likeness, but as a spiritual image and likeness, created by God, created out of love, for love, as a faithful, fruitful covenant between one man, one woman, that is intended to represent the love that Christ has for his church. The Catholic Church did not create monogamy. The Catholic Church did institute the sacrament of matrimony, but ultimately God is the one who authored this divine providence, this divine initiative to be unitive with our spouse and procreative, to bring life into the community. And that can mean children, but that can also mean service, because not every couple is called to have children. And so we looked at portions of this document in morality last year, and it's important to note that children are absolutely positively a component of marriage. By no means are they not. But they are not the only way to bring life to the community. And so there are options for those who are unable to have children. One thing to pay attention to in this document is there is certainly some mention of contraceptives, of birth control methods. And so I can understand why that algorithm did say what it did say. But it's important to note the context in which they're brought up. That the Pope Paul brings up contraceptives as sort of subversions of the natural order. That there have been, particularly in the 1960s, right, there's this uptick in the idea that liberty equates to promiscuity, that you getting to do with your body what you wish is liberty, is the most natural and normal thing in the world. And that in order to do that, all you need to do is make use of one of any number of chemical or physical means to subvert biology and prevent the natural occurrence when two people are physically intimate, which is to have children. And so there are a number of, and we talked about this in class before, there are a number of options in terms of how that occurs. Many of them, or most of them, for women. And I know we've discussed at length how that sort of perpetuates a male-dominant consumerist paradigm. There are also physical procedures. And I do want to note here, so a vasectomy and tubal ligation, the intended purpose would be to prevent conception, but not necessarily in a hysterectomy, right? And we talked about this at length last year, that if you are someone who, say, had ovarian cancer and had to have a hysterectomy, that would not be considered to be a direct sterilization. Now, if you went in of your own volition with no prior history, no existing illness, no problem, and you just elected to have a hysterectomy, certainly that would be different. But important to note, though they are referenced, they are not necessarily inherently the same thing. And certainly, as we look at 5 years after the publishing of this document in 1973, we have Roe v. Wade. So the Pope's sort of out a little bit ahead of the formal legislation on abortion in this country, but he goes on to outline that there are several consequences of introducing these subversions to the Catholic paradigm, a paradigm that is intended to uphold, again, that faithfulness, that fruitfulness, the lifelong union and procreative spirit that is intended to be in a marriage, right? Infidelity being chief among them. This idea that if you have increased access to physical and pharmaceutical means to prevent conception, then you are more likely to value that physical act, which initiates this immediate release of brain chemicals, right, the stimulants, you are much more likely to want to seek that more often. And that can, within a marriage, lead to the objectification of a spouse, not just women, but certainly in most cases women. But also, in the event that that's not possible in your own household, to seek that elsewhere. So you would see, and you would be likely, you would be likely to see an uptick in marital infidelity, and as a result there, obviously, a lowering of moral standards. So both of those things sort of coincide. You also give to public authorities the option to make these things viewed as a public good when that's not inherently true of these issues. Contraceptives, abortion, that's not considered to be a public good. It can be twisted that way, it can be spun that way by a government, but objectively speaking, they're not. So you end up with certain public policies that begin to enforce rules on families, rules on marriages that otherwise wouldn't be there. For example, the one-child law in China, right? Outside of a culture that has these opportunities for contraception and abortion, you don't have the ability really to create and enforce a rule like that. And that's not to say that it's good to have overpopulation and what have you. Like, I don't want to be misquoted there, but it is important to note that the Catholic Church is fundamentally against a government legislating family size, mandating or prohibiting children. So the Pope then puts forward, what are some ways then that we could actively continue to have this Catholic worldview of relationship, particularly marriage, without relying on, without subverting, without going back to this consumerist paradigm? How do we mitigate some of these factors? And so he puts forward this idea of natural family planning, which is a method by which you can regulate your family size by being mindful of the monthly fertility cycle for men and women. And the great thing about this, which I think is actually really interesting, is that it demands a level of knowledge about your spouse that transcends what most people would assume on a day-to-day basis. Because for most people, having a conversation around ovulation and menstruation is not something that a husband and wife would tend to do of their own volition. But that level of knowledge of one another is perfectly normal and perfectly natural in a relationship that is built on shared sacrifice, shared values, and shared goodwill of not just the two people, but of their family unit. So natural family planning, in addition to helping a family actually plan naturally the size of their family, also brings two people together in a way that is certainly intended, but in many cases unforeseen for the two people. And ultimately, that's what solid, grounded relationships are about. Passion absolutely, positively has to be a part of a marriage, but there has to be something that sustains the relationship throughout. And this is true of marriages, it's also true of friendships. Just because two people are well suited to one another doesn't mean that they're going to be the best of friends. There needs to be a deeply embedded sense of knowing one another. And as you sort of go about your life, and as you're finishing high school and you're moving into college, and you begin to see who your real friends are, you're going to notice that there's an underlying theme about the people who stick with you. And those people that stick with you, there is a connection to them that transcends awkward conversations. There's a connection to them that transcends feeling uncomfortable or embarrassed around them. And natural family planning is very much a part of that when it comes to two married people. Because if you can have really deep, important conversations about planning someone's cycle across a month, you're probably not going to be uncomfortable to be able to share other things with them too. Things that are less quote unquote awkward. Because ultimately your whole life is about getting through awkward moments. And natural family planning is a great way of having a couple work through those awkward moments for the betterment of the unit. So we'll stop there. We'll pick up with theology of the body in the next video. There's also a video referenced in the next one, so just to kind of be on the lookout for that. There's a video by Father Mike Schmitz embedded in our folder. You can watch that before the next video, or you can watch that after the next video. It doesn't matter. Either way, I'm going to be going through the sort of the contents of that video. So important to have that watched as well. Lots of videos. You probably expected that. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you next time.